Okay, so next topic of discussion, Unit 4.2, Part 4, following proto-industrialization. In Part 3, we're going to talk about a result of that proto-industrialization, which is mercantilism in the Atlantic economy. Mercantilism in the Atlantic economy is going to be led up to by proto-industrialization. It's going to lead us to European maritime expansion, which is a spectacular enrichment of commercial expansion. At this point, world trade is going to become critical to the European economies. And the number one important economy, as we've talked about in semester one, is going to be sugar. It's going to be driving along this maritime expansion. And along with sugar, we know, must come our second S, which is slaves, because sugar is a very labor intensive crop. And the slave trade is going to become enormous at this time. Our third S we'll get to in a little while is going to be spices such as coffee and tea from the Middle East and India, but we're also going to have a little discussion of tobacco, cotton, and indigo, important as well, as you remember from the Columbian Exchange, coming from the New World. So Spain and Portugal at this time are going to begin to revitalize their empire and grow economically from renewed development. But the three countries that are going to go the greatest due to trade on the Atlantic are going to be England, the Netherlands, and France. And by far of these three, England is going to have the largest number of immigrants to the New World at this time. So we're going to hit here with the slave trade and with the opening of maritime expansion in the Atlantic and the growth of these three nations. We're going to have to hit on some terms that are very familiar from semester one, which is mercantilism. Yet again, going to keep it short here. Main goal, self-sufficiency, a favorable balance of trade by exporting more than it imported, more than the country imported, and also placing tariffs on goods that are imported. So we have this opposition of capitalism here. This is a hands-on government. This is trying to keep things very self-sufficient and being able to be built up in one's own nation. And the ultimate goal being bullionism, where they are trying to build up their reserves of gold and silver to prevent the flow of these metals into different countries. You don't want to let a whole bunch of gold and silver go into another country because you imported a bunch of goods from them and then go to war with them. And so bullionism being the goal. In context to the Atlantic trade, colonies are going to exist for the good of the mother country. They're going to take all of the sugar or raw materials from their colonies and sell it to other countries to get more gold and silver, bullionism always being the goal. This money does not go to the colony. It's going to go to the mother country, and the colonies are support of that mother country. And this allows these big nations to not have to buy a finished product from a rival country. Again, self-sufficiency and mercantilism. Being built up with the expansion of these colonies. And of course, as we talked about, the Netherlands, France, and Britain are going to be our largest here with their expansion into the New World and the use of their colonies to bolster mercantilism and bullionism from the standpoint of a mother country. States at this time are also going to grant monopolies. We've talked about some of these companies, the East India Company, and we'll see those again. Great Britain, however, is going to become our leading maritime power. Before them, as you remember, it had been the Dutch in the late 17th century. And one of the reasons that England is going to become the leading maritime power is because they create a central bank. The Bank of England in 1694 is going to provide an important source of capital for economic development. You can get money to invest if you're a merchant capitalist. You can buy a ship to participate in this maritime trade. So Great Britain's central bank is going to be one of the biggest factors for its rise to the forefront in maritime power and taking that spot from the Dutch. And we'll talk about what happened to the Dutch and how Great Britain pulls ahead here. But they, in the 18th century, if you get this question on an AP exam and it says who was the world's leading maritime power in the 18th century, we're into Great Britain. If it said 17th century, you would put the Dutch or the Netherlands. We have another thing going on also at this time for Great Britain that's going to allow it to move ahead and become the world's largest maritime power, and that's that Great Britain is going to start uniting within this time period. So we have the Central Bank in 1694, but in 1707 we have the Act of Union, which brings England and the Scots together. As we've talked about before, the English and Scots, all first semester are fighting each other, fighting against each other, and have a lot of turmoil. But now we have the Scots saying, yeah, we'll come together, we'll unite with you, And why? Well, simple answer, it always comes down to money. They want to seek the benefits of trade within the English Empire. They want to be part of this. They see Britain as heading out into the forefront, and they want, their own piece of the pie. This unity is going to, in turn, help Great Britain continue to expand forward because they are going to have unity and less war, which is less money being spent and less allocation within their own empire. So you probably haven't been listening much to me. You've been probably staring at the flags here at the bottom of the screen. But to the left, you're going to see this Scottish flag of the Cross of St. Andrew, and then the English flag at this time, the Cross of St. George. And so when they unify in the Act of Union in 1707, they blend the two flags together to get the Union Jack, which is there central on the slide. Later, and as we get to this, in 1801, we're going to add Ireland in, and we'll add some more stripes to the Union Jack, and this gets the current Union Jack of the British Empire, of Great Britain. And so this is the development of the flag. I can't remember, there was a great Big Bang Theory episode where Sheldon's trying to teach a lesson on each flag of the world, but here's my little spiel on the history of Great Britain's flag. So we're going to have some blending and some unity, which is going to help Britain out. Britain is still going to have a little bit of mercantilism, but it's going to start to develop differently also in this time period, very different than French mercantilism. French mercantilism, if you remember from our mercantilist policies under the absolute monarchs of France, is all about making the state powerful, while British mercantilism at this time is going to be about making the state powerful, but also is going to start to pass or continue to pass laws to help private investors or to help businesses. And why does this happen in Great Britain? Because Great Britain has a parliament. And the members of parliament, as we saw time and time again in semester one, are going to be these upper class, private landowners, wealthy, and they're going to push through things that benefit them, as they had when they started passing the Enclosure Acts in the 1600s and the Corn Laws that we discussed earlier in Unit 4.2. They're going to pass laws that are mercantilist, but are also going to help those private individuals. The best example of British mercantilism, and something that will come into great play as we move towards the Revolutionary period, American Revolution, French Revolution, but one of the greatest examples of British mercantilism is the Navigation Acts. And also shows their private interests as well, or wanting to make the state powerful, but also through private industry. And so what the Navigation Acts say is that anything that came into Great Britain has to come into Great Britain on a British ship with a British crew. The point of this, if it's a British ship and it's a British crew, gold and silver is not going anywhere else. Okay, you're keeping all of the money within your mother country, within your nation. You're keeping your money and also protecting private interests. But they're also doing something that's going to be a little bit different here, is that they are going to not consider their British colonies British. It can't be the New World Colony ship and the New World Colonies crew. And what it's going to do is it's going to start to anger those in the 13 colonies. We are going to get mad about the Navigation Acts of the 1650s. And this comes about 100 years before the American Revolution. But if you talk about building tensions, this is going to be one of the very first. Because we considered ourselves British. What are we, separate? Why aren't we reaping the benefits of this mercantilism? And so this is going to lead us up to the American Revolution. The Navigation Acts, just a little side note here, actually start when there's no king in control. In the 1650s, you remember we have Oliver Cromwell, who's taken over with his new model army. And so this will be put in place, the Navigation Acts under Cromwell. And then they will be restored under King George the First, the Second, and the Third, and continue then into the Hanoverian kings will also do the same thing. And so that's going to lead us right up into our next unit, into the revolutions, and some of the tensions that are building in the colonies we'll touch on at the end of this unit. So now we need to kind of do some review from 8th grade, triangular trade. This should sound very familiar to you. We just need to discuss it in the time period we're in right now. And so what's happening on the Atlantic is the main thing, that if you're going to ship something in this maritime trade system, you never want to have an empty ship, and that's going to develop something called triangular trade. You want to drop something off and pick something else up. There's a couple of different scenarios here in your notes for triangular trade. The scenario I'm going to talk about, scenario 1. So you leave with your ship full of Africans from the west coast of Africa, and then go across the Atlantic. You're going to drop these Africans off probably in the Caribbean, where they are made into sugar plantation slaves. And then you pick up sugar from those sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and you take a stop in the northern colonies where they might distill it and make rum. And then you might come back across the Atlantic to Africa, where you might trade the rum for people. And you just keep your ship full and going across the Atlantic. Or you might take slaves from the Caribbean to Britain, or take slaves from South America. But you always have your ship full, or something on your ship, to maximize profit. To make it a profitable entity. You never cross the Atlantic with nothing in your ship. And so this is what is called triangular trade. It's going to revolve around the West Indies and the Caribbean, and also include North America and Africa. So never moving your ship without anything on it. And so now we've reviewed from 8th grade triangular trade, and you're all hip on that. We need to go back. So what did happen to the Dutch Republic? Why are we talking about the British? How did they sneak up here and become the world's leading maritime power at this time? So the Dutch Republic at this time are also trying to trade, but they are falling behind. They had their golden age in the late 17th century, and then the British kind of came up and overtake them. And we've discussed a lot of this, but it's all kind of interwoven. So the Dutch middle class is not dominated by a king. We know this, we talked about it in semester 1. They are laissez-faire. They are decentralized, as opposed to France, where they are all centralized by a king or an absolute monarch. The Dutch are all separated into provinces and kind of doing their own thing. It's entrepreneurial, capitalistic. Everyone is out there, making their own money, doing their own thing. But they were there first. They were in the New World first. They had their golden age in the late 17th century, and they had purchased Manhattan, called by them New Amsterdam, and they had paid like $24 to $26 of beads, hatchets, etc., where New York is today. Like the best deal, real estate deal ever, or best tribal trade as it had been. But what happens then is they have it and the English want it. So it's going to start a series of Anglo-Dutch wars. And this is in your notes. You can read along here. So pretty much to sum it up, there's this period where the British are the Anglos, of course, and the Dutch are the Dutch, and they start to butt heads or are fighting for resources and trade across the Atlantic. What is the one place Britain wants? Manhattan. And so they're going to take it from the Dutch in these series of the 3 Anglo-Dutch wars between 1652 and 1674. And this is really going to damage Dutch shipping and commerce in the New World. And so they're going to take it from the Dutch and rename it New York after the Duke of York, who was responsible for taking it, and so on and so forth. And so they fight. And the British are going to become the supreme in this relationship. Due to the Dutch-Anglo wars, they become the supreme. But something else is going to happen. Something that you may not have expected is when the Dutch are kind of losing their foothold here and the British become supreme, the Dutch and the British are going to become natural allies. And this is due to that time period of Louis XIV that we talked about in first semester, trying to take over everything. He's wanting to expand. Won't be the first Frenchman to try it. Won't be the last. We're getting there in our next unit. So he's trying to take over everything, and the Dutch and the English are going to come together. And the Dutch, of course, with William of Orange, who's the elector of the Dutch provinces, will then become the English King William during the Glorious Revolution, as we've talked about. So the Dutch and English kind of come together during this time period, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, when Britain becomes superior. And so what do the Dutch do? We know they don't just disappear. After losing on the trade front with their loss of Manhattan, which becomes New York, or loss of New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, after losing out on this trade front, what do? Well, the Dutch have been superior and leading on the capital front. So what do you do with all of this capital that you built up? The Dutch decide, why not live off of it and live off the interest? So here's the plan. So this is what the Dutch are going to do. They have accumulated so much interest or capital that they're going to start lending money out. Well, to who? Well, your new ally, the British. So they lend the British money, and they collect in interest. And because they were so successful before, they can live off of that money and that interest from lending out money. And most 1/3 of the money in the English central bank that we talked about earlier comes from the Dutch. And so they keep their foothold there with capital and commerce, but they're going to lose their trade market in the New World after the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Eventually, the Dutch out of this will have their own bank called the Bank of Amsterdam, which we discussed briefly with the Golden Age of Netherlands, the growing into the Bank of Amsterdam. But they're really funding that great central bank of England that we just talked about. So now we have to go to the slave trade. So we've talked about maritime, we've talked about who's superior and how that happened. So we need to talk about sugar and slaves. The slave trade is going crazy in the 17th and 18th century. There are 10 million slaves transported across the Atlantic at this time. And half of the slave trade will take place on British ships. If you remember, the Asiento from the Treaty of Utrecht gave 25% will happen with the French, and it's in your notes here, but half of the slave trade will take place on British ships. So how does it work? Europeans would set up these slave forts or slave factories on the west coast of Africa to protect trade. You can go visit them. Here are some pictures. So these trade forter factories were really there to protect trade. And so most slaves are actually going to come from the interior of Africa. So some Africans, get into a fight or whatever, tribal difficulties, and so they bring these slaves or these captives from this battle from the interior of Africa to the coast. This is their first journey, and they trade and sell them to some white guy for guns, alcohol, cloth, etc. This is why you have in the picture a black guy leading the slaves to sell to a white guy. This first trip is from the interior of Africa to the coast. The second part of this trip is what is going to be called, and you should remember from 8th grade history, the Middle Passage. This is the trip across the Atlantic Ocean, and so many slaves are going to die on the ship. 20 to 25%, 1/3 of slaves will actually die en route to the New World while on these slave ships. Why? Well, particularly due to overcrowding. You're going to see a diagram of a ship here in a second, but it's back into that mercantilist policy. You do not go across the Atlantic with your ship empty, and so you are going to pack it to the max, expecting that people are going to die along the way. No empty ships, okay? So overloading, overcrowding. I mean, just the conditions that the slaves were packed in with. Chains were used. I mean, can you even imagine this long journey and being restricted and confined like that? So these slaves that are taken across triangular trade, the Atlantic trade, are taken to the Caribbean, where they'll be broken and then sold to British North America or maybe Brazil to work on these sugar plantations. So many slaves are actually going to go from the Caribbean to North America that it's going to develop a wealthy planter class. And why is this wealthy planter class important? Well, these are men like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, the wealthy upper class, who are going to make a profit, and with all of these workers to do the work for them. And what do you have if you have everyone doing the work for you? Well, you're going to have a lot of time on your hands to do things like, I don't know, write the Declaration of Independence or fund the American Revolution. So they can thank slaves for all this time on their hand to rebel against their mother country. So in 1776, just to kind of give you some dates where we're moving, is the American Revolution. This time period, 1783, we win the American Revolution. 1789, we have our Constitution. And at that time, in 1790, just 2 years after the Constitution is written, we have 20% blacks in America. That is a bigger population or percentage than today. What the census says today is that the population in U.S. of blacks is not 20%, it's less. It's 13 to 14% at this time. So how did that happen? Well, one reason, so many others have come. Okay, we have the Hispanic population is now bigger than the black population in the United States. And at this time period, about 1780s to 1790s, the slave trade is actually going to go down. Why in the 1780s and 90s? Because so many are brought over in the time period before that they have children. And there are so many slaves that there is not as much of a need to bring any more over. And actually, by 1807, the British are going to abolish the slave trade. And we're going to talk about that later as we get to that time period. There's a movie, I think it's called Amazing Grace. I'm going to try to bring it in as an extra credit movie when we get to that part. But it's really great. So an extra credit movie opportunity in second semester. So that's the slave trade, really expansionist, but 1807 we're going to see, cut off enough slaves are being born actually in the New World that it's not needed. And so most of the subsequent increase in New World slave population will come from natural population growth. So the next thing we need to talk about is something economically that's going to happen, and it's called the bubbles. And the bubbles is an economic term that is used in economics to explain kind of a phenomenon. And there's two examples of bubbles at this time. One with the British and one with the French, because both Britain and France have faced massive national debts due to numerous wars fought in the 17th and early 18th centuries. But the best way I can kind of describe a bubble in terms you might understand is we're moving into these two bubbles, one with the South Sea bubble and one with the Mississippi bubble. So when I bought my house, let's see, I was to be 2001, 2000-ish, the interest rates were really low and everybody was buying, and so you bought a house for $100,000 and the next year it was worth $200,000 because the more that people buy, prices go up and demand goes up, and so everybody's wanting to buy. And so what happens, all these people are buying money, and somebody gets to turn to their friends, I bought my house for $100,000 and I just sold it a year later for $200,000 and I didn't have to do anything. And so what are your friends going to all do? They're going to go, well, I might buy another house, on top of the house I already have to make a profit, and maybe they're borrowing money that they can't afford to pay back or afford to. And so what happens is all these people, it creates a frenzy, and everyone starts to do the same thing, and the prices keep rising. But just like when you're blowing bubbles outside, you know that it can't last forever. You blow the bubble bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's going to have to burst or collapse. And this is when a bubble happens. So what happens is then the bubble is going to kind of burst because people aren't getting the prices they expected out of things. Or like, let's say the bank is like, that person bought that house for $100,000 and it says it's worth $300,000, but it's not worth that. And so these people may have bought this house for $200,000, but it's now, it's really worth $100,000, and so they're not going to make a profit. In fact, they're sitting on like what you call almost like a reverse mortgage. And so what happens is people get scared. And when people get scared, it's just like the stock market or anything else. They get scared and they start to sell very rapidly. And it causes this like speculative frenzy. And it will make everything, I guess you could say, collapse. If you know anybody that bought a house maybe like 2007, 2008, same thing, like their house is worth less than they probably paid for it because the bubble burst and the market values, they just crash or plummet. And so that's an example of what a bubble is economically. Drive up, everybody thinks they can make a profit, but when they're not making their money back fast enough, they start to sell, and prices fall, and people are stuck owing more than what something is worth. And so the two examples of bubbles that are results of Britain and France's massive national debts due to their numerous wars that we talked about in first semester are going to be the South Sea bubble. So we talked about those monopolies. In 1719, the British government's going to give the South Sea Company rights to take over their national debt, and the company had been given a monopoly of the slave trade with Latin America a few years earlier. They would presumably make a profit from the interest collected from the government on the debt, but when the investors didn't start to make their money back fast enough, the company converted the debt owed to them into shares of stock. And the speculative frenzy drove stock prices higher as investors believed prices would continue upward. Just like everyone's buying a house, I'm going to turn around, flip this house, make a profit. But the bubble burst in 1720, resulting in the first large-scale financial crash. I mean, 20s are not good for finances. You ever noticed that throughout history? And it will take years then to restore confidence in the British government's ability to repay its debts. Another example of the bubble is the Mississippi bubble in 1720. Here again, the 20s. The Mississippi Company was granted a monopoly by the French government on trade with French Louisiana and North America. And in 1719, the company took over France's national debt in exchange for company shares of stock. In 1720, though, after dramatic price increases in stock shares, the price of the stock collapsed and the Mississippi Company was ruined. And the national debt in France would remain staggering. And this is going to play a role in the French Revolution 7 decades later, our next unit. And so, why are we talking about all these economics? Not only the Enlightenment theorists and economics that came out of that Enlightenment time period, but we're building up to some things that are going to put the chess pieces in play to set us up for what's going to happen in our next unit. So those are two examples of bubbles here. Here's the graph of the South Sea Company. You can see as the stocks rising, and then the bubble burst in 1720, and the collapse, long scale collapse into 1722, where things are going to start to level out there, but we'll get there later. And so the next thing that we're going to need to talk about is something else going on this time period. So the British and the French had drastic national debt, which is going to cause the monopoly of them selling their debt out and cause these bubbles. But what is also going to begin happening is the French and British aren't just going to leave these wars at home anymore. They have new world territories, and we're going to start to see these wars turn into kind of world wars, expand out into the world. And so the colonial wars here at this time period could be considered part of a second 100 Years' War. So the colonial wars, we're going to have Britain and France being our two main adversaries. Nothing new. We've talked about this in first semester, but they're going to start taking these battles over into wars for an empire, colonial wars for an empire. And so Britain versus France is going to be a century long, 1689 to 1815. This is going to be a recap of a lot of the war stuff we've talked about with Britain and France. We're going to talk a little bit more just with Spain, but Britain and France are going to be our two main adversaries. And we've covered a lot of this, but why we're talking about it now is in the context of how trade and expansion are going to be the main reasons for these colonial wars. And we're not going to leave the Netherlands, I'm not forgetting about them, but they're kind of out of this now after the Anglo-Dutch Wars. They are, they've become a natural ally with the British, and so they've lost New Amsterdam, and so we're not going to see a lot of recap of them right here, but that's where they are. So England versus France now, but Spain will pop up now and again, just as it did first semester, but Spain is kind of on its decline right now. And so the 100 Years' War with England and France now is going to become a world war. And it's going to become a world war because now it's not only just in England and France, but it's going to be fought in their colonial empires in the New World. So now if we take a look at the actual wars we've talked about, most of them we've talked about. The first one is going to be, and I said the Spanish would pop up, is the War of Spanish Succession. And so the War of Spanish Succession, which we've already addressed in semester 1, 1701 to 1713, France, Spain, and Britain are all in on it, but what's going to be important to us as we talk about it right now is that because of this transatlantic trade, they're all bumping up against each other and their colonial empires. And then as we're going to see with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, we talked about this treaty, but how it pertains to us today is what's going to be lost. France is going to lose in the end. And what they lose is going to be important. France is going to lose Nova Scotia and the Hudson Bay area and the Newfoundland area in North America, also some eastern coast of Africa. And Spain is going to lose the Asiento that we've talked about previously to Britain. And as we've discussed before, this idea that Britain is going to be the one who can supply an unlimited amount of slaves to the Spanish Empire, along with that Spain agreed that Britain could bring in one other ship in addition to the slave ships that has goods on it into the Spanish Empire. So that, is going to hurt Spain's mercantilistic policies. You don't want another country bringing goods in. And so, if you are Spain, do you want anybody else trading with your colonies? No, this goes against the mercantilist policy. They're there to help the mother country. So, what is the purpose of this along with the good of the mother country? You don't want that to happen. But as a result of the War of Spanish Succession, you now have Britain now has the unlimited right to trade slaves, but secondly, they get to bring in one extra ship into Panama, which is really Britain's attempt in this agreement, this treaty. It's their attempt to make money off of the Spanish market, and that bullionism again right there. But this is going to leave, this treaty is going to leave potential for tensions with the Spanish. So, and what those tensions are is the Spanish are going to look at these British ships and are they going to say, does that have slaves on it or does that have goods on it? And this tension is going to create this, or cause the Spanish Anglo Wars of 1726 to 1729. This isn't in your notes, so you'll want to add here, Cornell style, just some background information. So, Spain is trying to get Gibraltar back. That they lost in the Treaty of Utrecht. They're not happy with this treaty and what they've lost, and so it causes all of this fighting. Fight, fight, fight. Are you smuggling? Does that ship have goods? It's hurting our mercantilism. Does it have slaves on it? What's going on? And so there'll be a lot more fighting, and finally a treaty in 1729 is going to give Spain the right to board these British ships to see if they are smuggling. Do they have more than one ship coming in with goods, or are they truly bringing in slaves, as the Jacinto said? This is going to lead to an incident where the Spanish will board a British ship to see if there's smuggling going on, and they're going to board the ship, and of course, you know, they're not countries getting along anyway at this time. Tensions are going to rise, and in those tensions, a Spanish guy who boards the ship is going to chop off the ear of the Spanish captain, and this captain's name happens to be Jenkins, aka the Jenkins Ear War. You saw this term on your practice test first semester, and a lot of you asked me if it was a real war. Yes, it is, and why it's called the War of Jenkins' Ear is because Jenkins is going to keep his ear. Okay, he's very attached to it, I guess. He takes his ear and he's going to preserve it in what would be on the ship alcohol. He's going to preserve it in brandy. And for 7 years, he's going to keep it. And 7 years later, he gets to Parliament and he pulls out his fermented ear and shows them. And look what the Spanish did to us. Look what they did to us 7 years later. And it's going to like piss off the Parliament. And so they're going to go to war. And so this Britain and Spanish War is going to morph into 7 years later the War of Austrian Succession. So you can see here he's showing the, I mean, it just creates all this tension. It's going to go from the War of Jenkins' Ear into what's known as the War of Austrian Succession. England and France are going to be fighting in North America and India. Spain too is trying to keep its empire intact and, you know, keep this, it's important, they're critical to their economies, these colonies. And so it's going to be equal the 7 Years' War that we've already talked about. And this is the biggest world war of the 18th century. It starts with George Washington and the colonies. He's actually going to be, you know, our first cause of a world war. He's sent into the Ohio Valley to tell France, you need to leave. And it sparks a conflict between Britain and France. And in Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. In North America, it's going to be called the French and Indian War, if you remember from U.S. history. And so the Prime Minister at the time is going to help Britain win the war. And his name is Pitt. And so the city in Pittsburgh is called after William Pitt. He's the Prime Minister at the time. And the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, is going to be the Treaty of Paris. And this becomes our next very important treaty. We talked about the Treaty of Utrecht, and it's the most important treaty actually since the Treaty of Westphalia. And France is going to be removed in this treaty from North America, from the St. Lawrence River Valley and New Orleans in Louisiana. There's no president yet. This is pre-United States, and King Louis is the king in France, so hence Louisiana. But France is going to be removed from North America due to this war. And Britain is going to get it all after. And so here we, again, why Britain is the greatest maritime power in the 18th century. You'll see in this map of decree to this war, and then after, there's no blue after. So France is removed from North America. And what comes next? Well, the American Revolution is going to come next. So the American Revolution comes about. The colonies, of course, all this tension been building since the Navigation Acts, not being treated as British, not getting the benefits of the mother country. And then after France is pushed out of North America, and Spain has been given some concessions in North America, which we're going to talk about the Spanish Empire next. What we're really going to see is that in hopes of weakening Britain's world empire, France is going to give significant financial and military support to the United States in its successful War of Independence. You've already had this in U.S. history. We're not going to go into it in much detail other than from a Euro standpoint. The 13 colonies have been Britain's most valuable colonial possession as both a source for raw materials and a large market for British goods. And of course, exponentially, all of the immigrants that had come over here. And so, are they still going to have some valuable territory? Yes. Even with the loss of the American colonies, the British are going to turn towards India for their colonial empire. And so not all will be lost, but this is a significant blow to the British and its North American colonies. And so what we're going to talk about next is the Spanish Empire. So what's going on in colonial Latin America? Spain has most of South America up to Mexico and even on up into North America, California, Colorado, New Mexico, etc. Talk about bullionism. The Spanish Empire holds lots of silver. Half of the world's silver supply comes from Mexico and Brazil, which is part of the Spanish Empire. And remember, this is a time period where the Spanish are reviving after the Habsburg rulers. The Bourbons have come through, bringing in new blood, new ideas, re-energizing the Spanish Empire. So the Navy here is going to become the third most powerful, the Spanish Navy, the third most powerful in the world, behind Britain and France. So a little bit of revival in Spain. But what I really want you to see, and why we're talking about the Spanish Empire, is how the empire is actually set up. It's set up very hierarchical. That means you're going to have a hierarchy. There's going to be people on top, and there's going to be people on the bottom. And we've hit on these terms a little bit in first semester, but not in great detail. And so we need to talk about what these separations and levels or hierarchical levels are for the Spanish in their New World empires. And so if you were a Spaniard who was born in Spain but who is living in Panama, so you were born in Spain and you're an immigrant, you have come over living in Panama or wherever you live within the Spanish Empire, you are going to have the rights and privileges of the Spaniards. So you're going to have the rights and privileges as if you were living in Spain. So different than the British colonists had. You're not considered separate. You're considered equal. And so you're going to be at the very top of the hierarchy. You are going to be the ones with all of the rights and privileges here. And the next level down then, these people are called Creoles. Both parents are Spanish. So you have the same ethnicity as a Spaniard who was born in Spain and came over, but since you were born in South America in the New World, even though you were pure Spanish blood, you are same ethnically, but you have not the same rights and privileges as your pure Spanish, okay, from Spain. You never resided in Spain. And so since you never resided in Spain, you don't have all of the rights, which, of course, are you going to be upset about that? You're 20% of the population. You're no different ethnically. And so this is going to be, these separations or hierarchies are going to be some of our causes of later revolutions in South America. Our next level down from the Creoles are the mestizos, and we've mentioned them before, but these are these have one Spanish parent and one Native American parent. And they make up 30% of the population. And then, of course, our South American or Native American population makes up, Almost 70%. So we have, these different levels. So this is a blending. So we start to see a blending of the peoples in South America. And so mestizos are one Spanish parent and one Native American parent. So we start to have blending. They have even less rights and privileges than the Creoles. And then below them, you're going to have the slaves that are brought over. Most of the Africans that are going to come over, the slaves, are going to go to the Portuguese into Brazil, and they become intermixed there, and this creates other hierarchies, and it becomes where there's a lot of mixture and different levels and different rights and privileges, and as I said, revolutions are going to follow. And the Portuguese, Indian, and African populations in Brazil are going to intermix socially to a greater degree than in the Spanish Empire. So Brazil is really going to become our hotspot of this intermixing and the different rights and privileges and tensions causing because of that, and it's going to result in a very multicolor population in Brazil, so Brazil being the most mixed. We're going to pick up, we've talked about colonial empires and maritime trade and all of this expansionism and the problems that it's caused and edging towards revolutions. We're going to pick up with the impact to society with our next section of 4.2, our last section of 4.2 in class.